The sacred mushroom in Hinduism and Buddhism. Chapter 1. How the ancient human mind works. Literalism instead of symbolism. Modern people almost automatically read myths as metaphors and rituals as allegories. We are accustomed to believing that ancient cultures were trying to express something, but lacked rational language, and therefore wrapped their ideas in images, fairy tales, and symbols. Such an approach, however, projects a modern mode of thinking onto the past, and thereby distorts the very nature of ancient experience. Ancient humans thought differently. Their thinking was not abstract symbolic, but literal and practical. If something worked, it was true. If something produced an experience of power, knowledge, or a departure beyond the ordinary state, it was perceived as a manifestation of the divine. There was no distance between phenomenon and explanation. There was no need to interpret when the effect was obvious. For this reason, in early cultures it is not an idea that becomes sacred, but an object, not a concept, but a source of experience. That which provides access to another state of consciousness does not symbolize God. It is God. Sacredness does not arise from morality, ethics, or philosophy, but from a direct cause and effect relationship between action and result. This is a fundamentally important point for the entire logic that follows. If we accept that ancient people thought literally, then myths and rituals cease to be poetic descriptions of abstract truths and begin to read as records of real experience. Not a story about something, but a way of preserving and transmitting knowledge of how contact with what is experienced as the divine is actually achieved. Such an approach changes the very way Hindu tradition is read. We no longer search for hidden philosophical meanings behind images. Instead, we ask a different question. What exactly happened to a person that caused them to see the world in this way? What experience stood behind these forms, colors, gestures, and narratives? Within this framework, it becomes possible to view Hindu epics, iconography, and rituals not as a system of belief, but as an archive of practical knowledge. Knowledge about states of consciousness, about transitions between them, and about the conditions that must be met for such transitions to occur. Everything else, gods, myths, symbols, turns out not to be fiction, but a language of fixation. It is precisely from this assumption that the proposed hypothesis begins. If ancient humans perceived phenomena literally, then everything declared sacred in Hinduism should first be considered not as a symbol, but as a source of real experience. Only afterward, as a form in which this experience was preserved for future generations. Chapter 2. The ecosystem of the divine, the cow dung, and the source of the sacred. If we accept the literal nature of ancient thinking as a starting point, the next step becomes almost inevitable. We must carefully examine what exactly is declared sacred within the Hindu tradition. And here one thing immediately stands out. It is not abstract ideas that are sacralized, but very concrete elements of a living ecosystem. The cow, pasture, dung, hill, earth. The modern perspective tends to explain this morally or utilitarianly. The cow is useful, it gives milk, therefore it was respected. The earth feeds, therefore it was venerated. For ancient humans, however, the logic was far more straightforward. If something generates a source of contact with the divine, then it itself possesses divine qualities. Not metaphorically, but literally. Within the framework of the proposed hypothesis, this logic unfolds very simply. A pile of dung produces the sacred mushroom. The sacred mushroom brings a human being into an altered state of consciousness, in which experiences of knowledge, revelation, and transcendence of the ordinary self arise. Therefore, dung is not waste and not an accidental element, but a primary sacred substrate. It does not symbolize the divine. It is its source. For the same reason, the cow becomes sacred, not as a mother in a sentimental sense, and not as a moral ideal, but as a carrier of the process. The cow produces dung. Dung gives rise to the sacred mushroom. The mushroom gives Bodhi. This chain requires no interpretation. It is obvious to an observer who sees the result with their own eyes. In this mode of thinking, the cow is not an animal among others, but a living element of a sacred technology. This explains why, in Hindu culture, not only the cow itself is sacralized, but everything connected with it: pastures, stalls, and bodily products. Sacredness here is neither moral nor symbolic, but functional. That without which contact with the divine is impossible automatically becomes part of the cult. In the same key, sacred hills should also be understood, Govardhana in particular. In later tradition, it is transformed into an object of mythological worship, but originally it may have been a fixed place of power, a landscape area where the ecosystem consistently produced the sacred mushroom. The hill, the pasture, the earth are not a backdrop for myth, but active participants in the process. Thus, Hindu sacredness grows not out of theology, but out of observable reality. That which works is declared sacred. That which grants access to another level of perception. That which repeatedly leads a person to experiences of knowledge and transformation. Only much later, when direct experience begins to be lost, do myths, explanations, and philosophical superstructures begin to form around these elements. Understanding Hinduism as an ecosystem of the divine allows for an important conclusion. At the center of the tradition originally stands not a god as a character, but the conditions for the emergence of a particular state of consciousness. Everything else, forms, narratives, iconography, are merely ways of preserving the memory of exactly which elements of the world made this transition possible. Chapter 3. The sacred mushroom as the central agent of the cult. Once the ecosystem of the sacred becomes clear, the cow, dung, pasture, earth, the main question inevitably arises: what exactly is the active element of this entire system? What makes the transition from the ordinary human state into the experience of the divine possible? Within the framework of the proposed hypothesis, the answer is exceedingly clear. This agent is the sacred mushroom. Here, the sacred mushroom should not be understood as a substance in the modern pharmacological sense, nor as an object of pleasure, but as a mediator between levels of consciousness. Its function is neither entertainment nor escape, but a radical transformation of the way reality is perceived. It is precisely this agent that initiates the process that, in Hindu and later Buddhist traditions, will be described as awakening, clarity, and liberation from illusion and false identity. For ancient humans, the sacred mushroom required no explanation. Its effect was immediate and convincing. It altered perception of the body, time, and space, dismantled habitual structures of thinking, and granted access to a state experienced as contact with the divine. For this reason, the sacred mushroom could not be merely one of the elements of ritual. It became its center, its heart. It is important to emphasize that within such a system there was no opposition between substance and spirituality. The sacred mushroom was not perceived as something external to sacred experience. On the contrary, it was precisely that through which the sacred became accessible. This explains why an entire complex of rituals, prohibitions, sacralizations of the environment, and methods of transmitting knowledge formed around it. Over time, The direct use of the sacred mushroom begins to acquire cultural shells. Stories, myths, and characters emerge, through which the experience can be transmitted to those who are not yet ready or not permitted to undergo the experience itself. It is crucial to understand, however, personifications appear after the experience, not before it. First comes the state, and only then the form capable of preserving it within culture. This is where the transition from ecosystem to myth begins. The sacred mushroom gradually ceases to be named directly and starts to manifest through images, deities, avatars, epic heroes. But if the original point is kept in mind, it becomes clear. Behind the multitude of names and forms stands the same agent, the same principle of transformation of consciousness. Thus, within this hypothesis, the sacred mushroom should be regarded not as a peripheral element of Hindu tradition and not as a late interpretation, but as the primary and central component around which the entire system of sacred knowledge is built. Everything that appears later, Hanuman, Ganesha, Krishna, Shiva, Kali, Vishnu, rituals, iconography, epics, will be different ways of describing, preserving, and transmitting the experience that was originally made possible by it. Chapter 4. Hanuman. The transition from animal consciousness to human consciousness. Between the ecosystem of the sacred mushroom and its subsequent personification in the images of gods within Hindu tradition, there exists one particularly important, yet often underestimated figure, Hanuman. His image seems to fall outside the familiar logic of the pantheon. He is neither a creator god, nor an avatar of a cosmic principle, nor a direct source of revelation. He is a half-human, half-monkey being, transitional, liminal, standing between the animal and the human. When Hindu epics are viewed through the lens of the literal thinking of ancient humans, Hanuman ceases to be a fantastical character. He becomes a fixed image of a transition of consciousness. This is not a metaphor and not an allegory, but a way of describing a state in which the biological animal nature is still present, while consciousness has already moved beyond it. Hanuman possesses speech, intellect, memory, strategic thinking, and the ability to comprehend divine intent. He is capable of serving Dharma consciously rather than instinctively. At the same time, his body remains that of a monkey. Such a combination appears strange within modern rational mythology, but becomes entirely logical if we assume that ancient culture was recording the moment of an evolutionary and psychological leap. At this point, a direct parallel emerges with the well-known hypothesis of Terence McKenna, according to which psychoactive mushrooms may have acted as a catalyst in the transition from animal perception to symbolic, linguistic, and self-reflective consciousness. In this reading, Hanuman appears not as a fairy tale hero, but as an epic testimony to precisely this transition. Especially revealing is the motif in which Hanuman holds or carries a mountain. In traditional interpretation, this episode is associated with strength and heroism. However, within the framework of the proposed hypothesis, this image acquires a different meaning. The sacred mountain, linked to pastures and the source of the sacred, is literally held in the hands of the monkey human. This is a visual assertion of the idea that it is the bearer of an animal body who becomes the custodian of the source of knowledge that transforms consciousness. Hanuman is not the source of this knowledge. He does not create it and does not personify it. He is the one who gains access to it and proves capable of holding the result. His famous devotion to Rama, in this context, can be understood not as religious submission, but as the consequence of ego dissolution and the transition to service of a principle rather than personal gain. Such a state is well known in the phenomenology of deep, altered states of consciousness. It is also important that Hanuman does not become a king, a teacher, or an object of worship in the strict sense. He remains a servant, a mediator, a guide. This emphasizes his function. He represents not the final point of the path, but a transitional stage. After him, Krishna as experience, Shiva as transformation, and Bodhi as the goal become possible. Thus, the image of Hanuman may be understood as a key connecting link between the biological nature of the human being and their spiritual aspirations. Within the logic of the proposed theory, he fixes the moment when animal consciousness, having come into contact with the sacred mushroom and its ecosystem, becomes capable of language, meaning, and service. This makes Hanuman not a secondary epic character, but one of the most precise and honest images of transition preserved in Hindu tradition. Chapter 5. Ganesha, Threshold, Access, and the Ecosystem of Beginning. If the figure of Hanuman, within the framework of the proposed hypothesis, symbolizes the transition from animal to human, that very monkey, who first entered an altered state of consciousness, then the next logical link is Ganesha. His place in the pantheon has always been special. Ganesha does not complete the path and does not crown it. He stands at the beginning. He is invoked first. Offerings are made to him before any ritual, and without him no mantra, sacrifice, or initiation begins. This is not an ethical or cosmic function, but a function of access. In traditional mythology, Ganesha is known as Vignaharta, the remover of obstacles. However, if this image is read literally, in a pre-allegorical key, it becomes clear that the reference is not so much to external barriers as to blockages of perception that prevent entry into another state. Ganesha does not grant Bodhi, does not bestow ecstasy, and does not destroy the structure of the ego. He opens the possibility, makes the path passable. In this sense, he is the ideal deity of the threshold. The key to a deeper understanding of this image is given by the very figure of the elephant. In India and Southeast Asia, the elephant is not merely a sacred animal, but an element of the ecosystem, a large herbivore associated with forests, moisture, shade, decomposition, and fertility. It is also important that elephant dung, like the dung of other large herbivores, constitutes a natural substrate for the growth of psilocybin mushrooms. For ancient literal thinking, the connection was direct and obvious. An animal that produces the environment from which the sacred mushroom arises itself acquires sacred status. In this context, Ganesha may be read not as a mushroom deity, in the direct sense, but as a personification of the conditions under which access to sacred experience becomes possible. He is connected not with the experience itself, but with its prerequisites: environment, preparation, and the removal of primary resistance. This is precisely why he is depicted as heavy, rounded, emphatically corporeal, and non-human. His form is closer to the earth, to digestion and processing, than to celestial abstraction. The iconography of Ganesha further reinforces this reading. In many temple images, he is placed within a niche, the architectural equivalent of a threshold, and above his head there is often a domed form situated on a pronounced axis. Traditionally, such elements are interpreted as ritual umbrellas or signs of protection. However, their biomorphic, monolithic form and lack of utilitarian features allow for another interpretation. Within the framework of this hypothesis, this may be a visual indication of the source of experience located above the threshold figure, but not yet personified. It is important to emphasize that Ganesha is never depicted in a state of ecstasy or transformation. He does not dance, does not tear the world apart, and does not dissolve into play. He stands. This is the stillness of a guardian protecting an entrance. After him, the path may continue. And this is precisely why, further along in mythological logic, deities of a different order appear. Krishna, Shiva, Kali. Ganesha remains the one who opens the door, but does not lead beyond it. Thus, in the proposed sequence of images, Ganesha occupies a strictly defined position between Hanuman and the mushroom deities. After the monkey who first touched the experience, there emerges a figure that ensures cultural, ritual, and ecosystemic access. Only after this do the deities appear who personify the sacred mushroom itself and the states of consciousness to which it leads. Chapter 6: Krishna as the personification of the sacred mushroom. When direct knowledge begins to require transmission, and experience itself demands preservation, culture inevitably turns to personification. That which cannot be constantly experienced directly acquires an image. It is precisely at this point that the figure of Krishna appears, one of the most recognizable and, at the same time, most paradoxical figures of the Hindu pantheon. Krishna is almost never depicted as a strict teacher or lawgiver. He is a cowherd, a child, a player, a trickster, a musician. He lives among cows, on pastures, outside cities and temples. He plays the flute rather than delivering sermons. These details are often perceived as folkloric or poetic, yet within the framework of the proposed hypothesis, they are read literally and functionally. Krishna's pastoral image points to a pre-civilizational context of the cult, in which the sacred mushroom was part of a living ecosystem rather than an institution. Krishna dwells precisely where cows, dung, and pastures are found, in the space where the source of sacred experience itself arises. He does not arrive from elsewhere and does not descend from heaven. He is always already there. Krishna's flute is one of the key elements of his image. It is not an instrument of information transmission, but an instrument of attunement. The flute works with breath, rhythm, and vibration, creating a continuous flow of sound. In this sense, it is functionally closer to a ritual anchor of state than to a means of communication. The sacred mushroom does not teach through words, and Krishna does not teach either. He induces a state, tunes perception, resonates. Krishna's behavior in the epics is particularly revealing. He does not moralize, impose rigid rules, or demand worship. His presence dissolves fear, relieves tension, and leads the human being beyond rigid dualities. This fully corresponds to the phenomenology of the sacred mushroom, which does not explain truth, but allows it to be experienced. One of the most widespread and visually stable motifs associated with Krishna is the episode of lifting Mount Govardhana on his little finger. In traditional interpretations, Krishna protects the cowherds and cows from destructive rain by creating a temporary shelter. However, if this image is examined not narratively but formally and literally, a different logic becomes apparent. Above humans and animals rises a massive domed form, held on a thin vertical axis. Viewed from a distance, Krishna with a raised Govardhana forms a characteristic silhouette, a thickened base and an expanding top, beneath which people gather. This composition strikingly resembles the form of a mushroom, under whose cap a protected space exists. It is also significant that these images almost always include water, rain, and a moist atmosphere, precisely the conditions required for mushroom growth. Humans and cows find themselves literally under Govardhana, or under the mushroom, in a space of shelter and abundance, while chaos and the elements rage outside. Within the framework of the proposed hypothesis, this scene can be read as a visual metaphor for the action of the sacred mushroom. It creates a temporary baloch, within which perception of reality changes, and a special state of safety, unity, and sacred experience is lived through. In this scene, Krishna functions less as a heroic savior and more as a personified principle of the mushroom itself. That which arises from the ecosystem, requires moisture, and grants access to another mode of being while the external world remains dangerous and unstable. One of the central episodes associated with Krishna is his dialogue with Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, presented in the Bhagavad Gita. Arjuna is in a state of profound existential crisis. On both sides of the battlefield, he sees relatives, teachers, and friends, and the very idea of battle paralyzes his will. This is not merely fear of death, but a moral collapse, a state in which habitual values no longer function. It is at this moment that Krishna begins to speak. Traditionally, this dialogue is interpreted as a philosophical instruction delivered by a divine teacher. However, within the framework of the proposed hypothesis, another, more literal interpretation becomes possible. If the scene is regarded not as an external conversation, but as an inner experience, Krishna ceases to be an external mentor and becomes the personification of the sacred mushroom. Arjuna is not listening to a lecture, but undergoing an altered state of consciousness, initiated by participation in a ritual or by ingestion of the sacred mushroom. Krishna's voice is experienced not as opinion or persuasion, but as absolute, unquestionable truth emerging from a deeper layer of perception. This is precisely how the inner voice is experienced in psychedelic states, not as a product of the ego, but as knowledge devoid of doubt. Krishna's statements, "You do not kill and cannot be killed," act without attachment to the fruits of action, correspond to core psychedelic insights. Ego death, the vision of oneself as part of an infinite process, and liberation from fear of personal drama. The culmination of this experience is the 11th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, in which Krishna reveals to Arjuna the Vishvarupa, the universal form in which the birth and death of all beings, the cycles of creation and destruction, and past, present, and future are simultaneously present. This description is difficult to reduce to abstract philosophy. It has a distinctly visionary character, and in its structure, corresponds to classical descriptions of high-dose psychedelic experience. Arjuna does not see arguments, but reality itself in its totality, and it is precisely for this reason that he becomes ready to act. Not because he was logically convinced, but because he saw directly, without intermediaries, without interpretation, in a state where truth is experienced rather than explained. Thus, Krishna may be regarded as a humanized image of the sacred mushroom, not in a biological, but in a functional sense. He embodies not a substance, but an experience, not an object, but a process of transformation of consciousness. Through the figure of Krishna, culture acquires a way to speak about that which by its very nature resists direct description. This is precisely why Krishna is so multiform and elusive. He is simultaneously a child and a charioteer, a lover and a guide, a trickster and a source of supreme knowledge. These contradictions are not flaws of the image. They reflect the non-linearity of the experience itself. The sacred mushroom dissolves habitual categories, and Krishna, as its personification, does the same. With the appearance of Krishna, mythology takes the next step. An experience previously tied to ecosystem and ritual acquires a face and a voice. Yet behind this face still stands the same agent, the sacred mushroom, whose action can now be transmitted in the form of story, epic, and divine play. Chapter 7. The Blue Color of the Gods, a visual trace of the sacred mushroom. One of the most persistent and, at the same time, least explained elements of Hindu iconography is the blue color of the skin of certain deities. In later commentaries, it is usually associated with the sky, infinity, or cosmic depth. Such explanations, however, once again project modern abstraction onto ancient material. If we return to the principle of literal thinking, a different and far more concrete layer of meaning emerges. Psilocybin-containing mushrooms possess a characteristic feature. When damaged, broken, or exposed to air, they turn blue as a result of oxidation. This effect is not subtle or symbolic. It is immediate, visible, and striking. For ancient humans who did not separate substance from spirit, such a color change was a direct sign of active power. That which turns blue is acting. That which changes color is alive. In this context, the blue color in iconography ceases to be decorative and begins to function as a marker of state. A deity is depicted as blue not because it is celestial, but because the source of divine experience, the sacred mushroom, literally becomes blue at the moment of activation. The color records a phase of the process, not an abstract quality. It is especially important that not all deities are blue, but specifically those associated with transformation of consciousness and knowledge. Krishna embodies immediate insight and lived experience. Shiva represents the phase of ego dissolution and transcendence of form. Vishnu corresponds to the preservation and stabilization of a new level of perception after the experience. Rama embodies lived dharma, when state becomes action. Sarasvati expresses the articulation of experience into knowledge, sound, speech, and music. What unites them is not a function of power, but a function of understanding. Thus, the blue color becomes a unifying code of the entire system. It does not point to the character of a deity, but to the common source of their wisdom. Different figures reflect different stages of a single process, yet all carry the same visual trace of the sacred mushroom. This explains why blue appears so consistently in key images and is almost absent where the focus is on purely social, ritual, or cosmological order. Such a reading also explains the persistence of the color through time. Even when direct knowledge of the sacred mushroom begins to fade, the color remains. It continues to be copied, transmitted, and canonized, even when its original meaning is no longer fully understood. Blue becomes divine by inertia, but this inertia points to what was once an extremely concrete experience. As a result, iconography begins to function as a kind of chemical trace preserved within culture. Where blue appears, one may assume a connection with altered states of consciousness, knowledge, and transformation. Where it does not, the focus is likely on other functions, ritual, social, or cosmological. Color, like form, turns out to be not an ornament, but a means of preserving memory of what the action of the sacred mushroom looked like in lived experience. Chapter 8. Shiva and Kali, Dissolution, Initiation, and the Heavy Phase of the Experience. If the image of Krishna fixes the phase of entry into an altered state and the experience of insight, then the figures of Shiva and Kali describe the next, far more radical stage of the process. This is the stage of dissolution of the habitual structure of personality, the destruction of the ego, and the loss of former reference points. In modern terminology, it might be called a heavy phase or a bad trip. Yet within ancient tradition it was perceived not as an error, but as a necessary part of initiation. Within this logic, Shiva ceases to be a destroyer of the world, in a mythological sense. He becomes an image of the state that arises after activation of the sacred mushroom, when the familiar sense of I collapses. His blue skin indicates the active state of the source of experience, while his attributes point to the consequences of this state. Garlands of skulls, ash, cremation ground motifs, and the absence of social roles are not an aesthetics of horror, but an exact fixation of an experience in which former identities are already dead. Shiva is almost always depicted as calm. This is fundamental. There is no panic, aggression, or chaos in this image. On the contrary, there is cold clarity and the detachment of an observer. Such a state is well known in deep phases of altered consciousness, when personality has already dissolved, yet perception remains lucid. This is the point at which fear of death disappears, because the one who could die is no longer present. Kali represents an even more intense aspect of the same process. If Shiva is the result of dissolution, Kali is the very moment of destruction. She is depicted as frightening. with an extended tongue, severed heads, weapons, and bodies beneath her feet. Yet it is important to notice that there is no malice in her image. Her face is not twisted by rage. She acts not out of hatred, but out of necessity. The severed head in Kali's hand is not a victim, but a symbol of voluntarily relinquished control. It is the rational mind, logic, the attempt to cling to familiar explanations. The garland of heads is not violence, but an inventory of lost identities. What a person is no longer. These are discarded without regret. There is no morality here. There is a process of purification. Especially revealing is the motif of Kali standing upon the body of Shiva. In later interpretations, this image is often softened or morally explained. Yet within the framework of this hypothesis, it reads literally, "The body is present, breathing continues, but the personality is already absent. Consciousness is located above the body rather than inside the habitual narrative of the self." This is one of the most terrifying and simultaneously most transformative moments of the experience. It is important to emphasize that neither Shiva nor Kali punish or judge. They are not associated with sin, morality, or retribution. Their function is to destroy what is false so that a new state may become possible. In ancient understanding, without this phase, true knowledge could not be reached. Enlightenment without dissolution was considered an illusion. Thus, the images of Shiva and Kali fix that part of the path which later traditions often attempted to soften or bypass. Yet it is precisely here that the key to understanding the depth of the Hindu system lies. It does not promise easy light without darkness. It honestly shows that the path to Bodhi passes through the loss of everything by which a human being has become accustomed to defining themselves. Chapter 9. Lingam and Yoni, the manifestation of the sacred mushroom. One of the most ancient and enduring symbols of the Hindu tradition is the pairing of the lingam and the yoni. In later and superficial interpretations, this image is almost automatically reduced to sexual or phallic symbolism. Such an approach, however, reflects modern projections more than the original ritual meaning. For ancient thinking, the key element was not sexuality as an act, but generation as a fact, the moment when form emerges from a medium. It is crucial to note a fundamental detail. The lingam is almost always depicted as emerging from the yoni, rather than existing independently. In this composition, the yoni is not a female organ in a mundane sense, but a matrix, earth, a moist and fertile medium from which something arises. The lingam is a vertical form that rises from this medium and becomes visible. Within the framework of the proposed hypothesis, this scheme reads with striking literalness. The sacred mushroom emerges from Mother Earth. If later moral and sexual overlays are removed, the form of the lingam corresponds with surprising precision to this reading. It lacks individual features. It has no face, emotions, or biography. It is not an image of a body, and not a portrait of a being. It is a fixation of an event, the moment of manifestation. The lingam does not depict someone. It depicts the very fact of the appearance of the sacred agent. In this reading, the yoni ceases to be a symbol of femininity and becomes a designation of substrate. It may be earth, dung, moist soil, or a place of power, everything from which the sacred mushroom arises. The yoni is not passive, yet neither is it personified. It is a condition of possibility. It is especially significant that the lingam is inseparably associated with Shiva. Shiva is not a god of fertility or sexuality. His domain is the destruction of form, transformation, and transcendence of the ego. If the lingam is understood as the sacred mushroom, this connection becomes logical. The lingam is the manifestation, while Shiva is the state that arises after contact. First, the mushroom appears. Then the dissolution of the former structure of consciousness occurs. Ritual practice surrounding the lingam also supports this understanding. The lingam is not prayed to as a personality, nor is it attributed character or will. It is bathed, anointed, and touched. It is not asked. It is activated. This mode of interaction is far closer to engagement with an object of power than to the worship of an anthropomorphic deity. Thus, the lingam, yoni pairing, may be regarded as one of the earliest and most direct graphic forms for fixing a mushroom cult. There is no myth here, no narrative, no morality. There is only a scheme, medium, manifestation, transformation. Later interpretations may have added additional layers of meaning, but the original structure points to a concrete process experienced bodily and immediately. In this sense, lingam and yoni become an important bridge between ecosystem, experience, and iconography. They show how the experience of the sacred mushroom was translated into a form capable of surviving the loss of direct knowledge and remaining intelligible to those who no longer had access to the original source. Chapter 10. Forms without words. Umbrellas, domes, and sacred space. When direct knowledge begins to fade, culture seeks ways to preserve it not in words, but in forms. Texts can be rewritten, meanings reinterpreted, myths softened or moralized. Form, however, outlives words. For this reason, in traditions concerned with altered states of consciousness, particular significance is given to objects, gestures, and spatial constructions. In Hindu and related traditions, one of the most stable such elements is the domed form. Umbrellas, canopies, awnings, and symbolic coverings that appear in key scenes and rituals. They do not arise accidentally and do not function as decoration. Their role is to mark a space distinct from the everyday, a space in which a different logic of perception operates. An umbrella or dome almost never exists on its own. It is always positioned above someone or something important: a deity, a priest, a ritual participant, a hero's chariot. It is not a sign of power in the direct sense, like a crown or a throne. Its task is to create a temporary container of state, to protect and delineate a portion of space in which contact with the sacred becomes possible. When these forms are considered within the framework of the sacred mushroom hypothesis, the resemblance becomes striking. A thin vertical axis topped by an expanding dome reproduces the basic morphology of a mushroom. This similarity is especially evident in ritual umbrellas mounted on long, slender poles, used in regions where Hindu tradition has preserved pre-institutional features. Such forms appear less like architectural elements and more like markers of the presence of an active source of experience. In the stone carving of Hindu temples in India, as well as in classical iconography, so-called ritual umbrellas often display a distinctive morphology: a relatively wide, massive stem narrowing upward, crowned by a pronounced dome top. This shape corresponds poorly to an actual umbrella as an object, yet strikingly resembles the morphology of certain mushroom species, particularly Stropharia cubensis and related varieties. The thickened stem and substantial cap make the image stable and easily recognizable, especially given the repeated appearance of such forms in sacred architecture and sculpture. If these images are viewed not as everyday objects, but as fixed forms of experience, the resemblance to mushroom morphology ceases to be accidental and begins to function as a visual code. An especially telling contrast is found in Balinese ritual tradition. In Bali, temple complexes, processions, and temporary funerary structures prior to cremation make extensive use of umbrellas that are entirely devoid of utilitarian function. These consist of long, thin poles topped with small domes incapable of providing protection from sun or rain. Yet their form almost literally reproduces the morphology of mushrooms of the genus Pinealis and related species. A long, thin stem with a small cap. Such mushrooms are widespread in Bali's local ecosystem, whereas Stropharia species are rare or absent. In this context, it becomes plausible to suggest that the visual language of umbrellas adapted to local mushroom flora, preserving the principle of form while altering its proportions. This further reinforces the hypothesis that these objects function not as symbols of authority or protection, but as ritualized traces of the sacred mushroom, whose meaning was gradually reinterpreted without being erased. It is important to emphasize that the dome in this context does not symbolize the sky or divine protection in an abstract sense. It indicates a state. Beneath the dome, a person is under influence within a different mode of perception. This is a temporary condition, much like the action of the sacred mushroom itself, not permanent, yet radically transformative of the inner landscape. The same logic manifests in architecture. Temple domes, shikaras, stupas, and other vertical dome structures can be understood as attempts to fix in stone what was originally an experience. Architecture begins to perform the function once fulfilled by ritual. It designates a place where consciousness is expected to shift into another mode. Thus, forms without words become carriers of memory of a state. They do not explain or instruct. They show. A dome, an umbrella, a canopy requires no interpretation. It is enough to stand beneath it to sense that a different order is at work. In this sense, these forms continue the same line as the lingam. They fix not an idea, but the moment of activation of sacred space. Through such forms, culture preserves knowledge even when direct access to the sacred mushroom becomes impossible or forbidden. Space remains sacred by inertia. Form continues to point to lost content, and a careful gaze may still read within it the trace of an ancient experience. Chapter 11. Bodhi before Buddhism, the highest state of Hindu philosophy. When the subject of Bodhi, or, as it is commonly pronounced, Buddha, arises, modern consciousness almost automatically associates this concept with Buddhism and with the figure of the historical Buddha. Such identification, however, is the result of later religious canonization rather than a reflection of the actual history of ideas. The concept of Bodhi as a distinct state of consciousness appears in Indian philosophical tradition long before Buddhism emerged as a formal doctrine. In early Hindu thought, consciousness is described as a multi-layered system. The terms manas refer to the operational, reactive mind, chit to the stream of mental states, memory, and impressions, and ahamkara to the sense of I that identifies itself with the body and personal narrative. These layers are not considered final. On the contrary, they are viewed as structures to be transcended or transformed. Above them lies a qualitatively different state, that which is described through the root bud, meaning to awaken, to see clearly, to become directly aware. In this context, Bodhi is not an object of belief and not the result of intellectual understanding, but a mode of consciousness in which identification with the contents of the mind ceases. It is a state of clarity, direct knowing, and the absence of inner dialogue. Later, in yogic and tantric systems, this state would be localized in the image of the Sahasrara, the highest energetic center, depicted as a lotus. The lotus here is not a poetic symbol, but another expression of literal thinking. Something emerges from a muddy substrate, rises upward along an axis, and unfolds. This is the same logic present in the images of the lingam, the dome, or the mushroom. It is important to emphasize that in Hindu tradition Bodhi is not opposed to bodily experience. On the contrary, The path toward this state originally includes bodily, ritual, and ecstatic practices. Enlightenment is conceived not as moral perfection, but as a radical shift in the way reality is perceived. In this sense, Buddhism does not create Bodhi, but inherits it as a goal. The historical figure of the Buddha and the teachings that formed around him place emphasis on attentional discipline, ethics, and meditation, gradually abandoning mythological and ritual elements. Yet the very idea of a highest state of consciousness toward which the path leads is already present in the cultural environment from which Buddhism emerges. Understanding Bodhi as a pre-Buddhist concept allows Hindu tradition to be seen not as a precursor that Buddhism superseded, but as a broader system within which Buddhism becomes one crystallized form. The goal remains the same: awakening, while the means and language of description change. Thus, the entire system of images, rituals, and personifications examined earlier may be understood as oriented precisely toward this highest state. The sacred mushroom, the ecosystem, Krishna, Shiva, Kali, forms and colors, all function as elements of a path directed toward Bodhi long before this word became the name of a religious tradition. Chapter 12. Buddhism, Entheogens, and the Lost Key to Experience. If the concept of Bodhi or Buddha existed long before Buddhism, the next inevitable question arises: how was this state initiated in antiquity? The modern image of Buddhism as a strictly ascetic, rationalized, and completely immaterial tradition is the result of later interpretation. An increasing body of evidence suggests that early forms of Buddhist practice developed within a cultural environment in which the use of sacramental plants and substances was not perceived as marginal or contradictory to the spiritual path. One of the first collective works to openly address this question was the book Zigzag Zen, Buddhism and Psychedelics. In it, philosophers, Buddhologists, and researchers of altered states of consciousness consider psychedelic experience not as an opposition to Buddhist discipline, but as a possible initial catalyst for the states that were later formalized in meditative techniques. The authors emphasize that this is not about replacing practice with substances, but about an original experience that was subsequently integrated, reflected upon, and refined. A more systematic and historically oriented analysis is presented in Mike Crowley's book Secret Drugs of Buddhism, Psychedelic Sacraments and the Origins of the Vajrayana. Crowley attempts to reconstruct a forgotten layer of Buddhist ritual practice associated with the use of sacramental means, and traces continuity from Vedic Soma to Buddhist Amrita, the nectar of immortality that plays a central role in Vajrayana texts. According to his hypothesis, early forms of Amrita may have possessed psychoactive properties, while later symbolization resulted from the loss of direct access to the original ritual. Particular attention in Secret Drugs of Buddhism is given to iconography, analyzing images of vessels, domed forms, mushroom-like objects, and so-called ritual umbrellas. Crowley suggests that many of these elements functioned as visual codes of entheogenic experience. This idea directly resonates with what we observe in architecture and sculpture. Form is preserved in stone even when its original meaning ceases to be verbally articulated. In this context, the legend of Siddhartha Gautama acquires additional nuance. Prince Gautama spent years wandering and practicing austerities before sitting beneath the Bodhi tree and experiencing awakening. The region of Lumbini and the adjacent territories along the India-Nepal border have long been known for their rich entheogenic flora, a fact that remains true to this day. While it is impossible to assert direct use of such substances, the very possibility of their presence within the cultural environment of early Buddhism renders the entheogenic hypothesis not fantastical, but historically plausible. It is also notable that for approximately 5 centuries after the Buddha's death, He was not depicted in anthropomorphic form. Instead, symbols were used: an empty throne, footprints, pillars, the Bodhi tree, and domed forms resembling a cap on an axis. Within the framework of this hypothesis, this can be understood as the preservation of the form of the source of experience while deliberately refraining from its direct personification. One of the most revealing examples is the so-called first image of the Buddha, belonging to the pre-anthropomorphic period of Buddhist art. What we see is not a human figure, but a vertical composition consisting of an axis and a radial disc with a pronounced structure resembling the underside of a mushroom cap. For several centuries, Buddhism avoided depicting the Buddha in human form, preferring symbols and shapes. Within the framework of this hypothesis, this may be understood as a conscious preservation of the form of the source of Bodhi experience while abandoning its direct personification. Only later, as the tradition became institutionalized, did form give way to anthropomorphic image, and the object of experience transformed into a historical figure. Thus, a comparison of the ideas presented in Zigzag Zen and Secret Drugs of Buddhism allows Buddhism to be viewed not as a tradition completely severed from an entheogenic context, but as a system that traveled a path from direct, bodily psychic experience toward philosophical and ethical integration. The instrument disappears from explicit description, yet its traces continue to live on in symbols, forms, and ritual architecture, pointing to a lost, but not vanished, key to the state of Bodhi. Chapter 13. Hinduism as an archive of experience, not a religion of belief. If all the elements examined so far are brought together, the ecosystem, the sacred mushroom, personifications, colors, forms, rituals, and philosophical categories, the Hindu tradition begins to reveal itself in an unexpectedly coherent form. It ceases to appear as a fragmented pantheon of gods, myths, and rites, and instead reads as an archive of experience preserved within cultural memory. From this perspective, Hinduism emerges not as a religion of belief in the conventional sense, but as a system for fixing and transmitting experiences of altered states of consciousness. There is no need for dogma here, because experience was always the primary reference point. What is declared sacred is not that which is believed in, but that which provides direct access to the divine. The ecosystem, cow, dung, pasture, earth, becomes sacred because it produces the sacred mushroom. The mushroom becomes the central agent because it initiates the process of transformation of consciousness. Everything else is built around this core. In this reading, deities are not supernatural personalities, but keys to states. Krishna fixes the phase of entry and insight, Shiva the state after ego dissolution, Kali the radical moment of destruction of illusion, Vishnu the preservation and integration of a new level of perception, Sarasvati the articulation of experience into knowledge, sound, and meaning. Their blue color points not to abstract divinity, but to the visual trace of the action of the sacred mushroom. Forms and objects, lingam and yoni, umbrellas, domes, architectural verticals, preserve knowledge where words prove insufficient. They fix not an idea, but the moment of activation of sacred space, the state in which transition occurs. Even when direct access to the source of experience is lost, form continues to point toward it, even if without explanation. The concept of Bodhi completes this system as its highest aim. It emerges long before Buddhism and designates not a moral ideal or religious status, but a concrete mode of consciousness, clarity, awakening, and transcendence of identification. In this context, Buddhism becomes a tradition that preserves the goal while abandoning part of the instruments, simplifying the path, and making it accessible outside an ecosystemic and ritual framework. Such a reading does not seek to dismantle religious traditions or reduce them to a single cause. It proposes a different angle of vision. in which Hinduism appears as a cultural container of ancient knowledge about consciousness rather than a system of beliefs. This knowledge was too important to disappear and too dangerous to be transmitted directly. Therefore, it was preserved in myths, images, colors, and forms. If this hypothesis is at least partially correct, Hindu epics and rituals cease to be tales about gods and become encoded instructions for how human beings, over thousands of years, learn to move beyond themselves. Not through belief, but through experience. Not through explanation, but through direct encounter. Chapter 14. From the Mushroom to the Umbrella. How forms survive the loss of meaning. By this point, it becomes impossible to ignore one persistent fact. Mushroom-like forms in the sacred art of India and Southeast Asia are neither rare, accidental, nor local. They were systematically carved in stone, in temples, caves, on stelae, capitals, and reliefs, and appear in both Hindu and Buddhist complexes. This is not painting, which can easily be altered, nor text, which allows for editing. Stone is the heaviest and most honest carrier of memory. If a form is repeated thousands of times in stone, it was fundamentally important. At the same time, the morphology of many such objects leaves less and less room for neutral interpretation. We see a thickened stem, a clearly defined edge of the cap, a domed top, often with an emphasized corporeality of form. These objects do not function as utilitarian items. They cannot be folded, held, or used. They are immobile, monumental, and placed at the center of sacred compositions. In a number of cases, figures are shown holding these forms in their hands, at which point the question becomes almost rhetorical. What exactly is the figure holding, if this is neither a decorative attribute nor a practical tool? It is precisely here that the secondary interpretation of the umbrella emerges. It appears convenient and safe. An umbrella can be associated with protection, status, royal authority, or heavenly patronage. Yet such an interpretation poorly explains the biomorphic proportions, the insistence of repetition, and the frequent context of ecstasy, abundance, or transformation. Simply put, the umbrella as an object does not explain the form, while the form stubbornly refuses to be an object. Within the framework of the proposed hypothesis, it is far more logical to assume the reverse. Not that the mushroom was reinterpreted as an umbrella, but that the mushroom form gradually lost its direct meaning and came to be read as an umbrella, when direct knowledge of ritual, the source of experience, and its function began to disappear or became undesirable. Culture preserved the form while altering its explanation. This is a standard mechanism of cultural evolution. Content fades, the shell remains. This process becomes especially significant in the context of later religious reinterpretation. As monotheistic traditions strengthened and displaced older practices, any allusions to entheogenic cults became problematic. Open discussion of the sources of altered states of consciousness was no longer possible. Yet form could be preserved, renamed, endowed with a different meaning, and incorporated into a new ideology. Thus, the mushroom became an umbrella, the cap a canopy, and the object of experience a symbol of power or protection. It is important to emphasize that this need not be understood as a conspiracy or a deliberate destruction of traces. At least one would like to believe so. Rather, it is a long historical process of displacement and substitution of meanings. Stone preserved the form, while commentaries rewrote the explanation. This is why we encounter the paradox today. Thousands of stone images that resemble mushrooms are explained as umbrellas. If this hypothesis is accepted, many disparate elements suddenly assemble into a coherent picture. The mushroom form proves to be primary. The umbrella is a later rationalization. and the massiveness and persistence of this motif testify not to decorative fashion, but to a once central sacred object whose memory culture preserved even after losing the courage to name it directly. This chapter does not claim final truth. It proposes a shift of perspective, to look at familiar umbrellas as possible fossilized traces of a cult that survived changes of religions, languages, and ideologies. And if this view seems radical, it is only because it restores to form its original seriousness, the seriousness for the sake of which it was carved in stone. Conclusion: returning to the source. In this work, I have deliberately proposed looking at Hindu myths, epics, rituals, and iconography from an unfamiliar angle, not as a system of beliefs or poetic allegories, but as an encoded language of experience. Step by step, we examine the literal nature of ancient thinking, the sacred ecosystem of the cow, dung, and earth, the central role of the sacred mushroom, the personifications of this experience in the figures of Ganesha, Krishna, Shiva, and Kali, the visual codes of blue color, the forms of the lingam and yoni, domed structures of sacred space, and finally the concept of Bodhi as a highest state of consciousness that existed long before Buddhism. When all these elements are brought together, it becomes clear that they form not a random collection of symbols, but a remarkably coherent picture. In this reading, Hinduism appears not as a religion of belief, but as a cultural archive of practical knowledge about consciousness, knowledge that could not be preserved in direct form, and therefore had to be encoded in images, forms, and myths. Within this system, the sacred mushroom functions not as an exotic detail, but as a possible key agent of transformation, around which rituals, deities, and philosophical goals were structured. Of course, this work does not claim to offer an exhaustive description of all Hindu mythology, nor to provide a final decoding of every image and symbol. Outside the scope of this text remain such fundamental figures and principles as Brahman, the impersonal absolute Indra, the Vedic god of power and heavenly authority, Agni, Varuna, Soma, and many other deities and concepts, each of which deserves careful and independent analysis. The aim of this study was not total interpretation of the pantheon, but the demonstration of a general structural principle, a stable connection between Hindu mythology, iconography, architecture, and ritual with a cult of the sacred mushroom as a source of altered states of consciousness and the experience of Bodhi. The images and forms discussed here are proposed not as final meanings, but as elements of an encoded teaching whose language gradually lost its explicit explanation but survived in symbols. Much, therefore, inevitably remains beyond the frame, not as an omission, but as an invitation to further research. It is important to emphasize that the idea presented here does not claim ultimate truth. It is a hypothesis, an attempt to connect disparate facts, iconographic, philosophical, anthropological, and phenomenological, into a single logical chain. It does not negate existing religious interpretations and does not seek to devalue them. On the contrary, it offers a way of viewing ancient traditions with respect for their practical depth and for the level of knowledge about consciousness that their carriers may have possessed. I will speak honestly. The idea of looking at Hindu tradition from this perspective did not arise in an academic office. It emerged after an independent mushroom session I undertook, in which an experience familiar from descriptions of altered states of consciousness coincided in a striking way with images long known from Hindu mythology and iconography. As a practicing hypnologist and researcher of altered states of consciousness, I could not ignore this coincidence. It demanded reflection, calm, sequential, and honest. Perhaps, over time, such hypotheses will attract the attention of academic research, archaeological, ethnobotanical, neurophenomenological. Perhaps they will be refuted, refined, or radically revised. But this is precisely how living knowledge develops, by daring to ask an uncomfortable question and allowing it to be heard. If this text fulfills even one task, if it encourages the reader to look at ancient traditions not as naive fairy tales, but as complex and profound attempts to work with human consciousness, then it will not have been written in vain. Sometimes, to understand the past, one must not so much search for new facts as risk looking at familiar things from a different angle and allow them to speak anew. Afterward, the writing of this work was prompted by several factors that gradually converged into a single line of observation and reflection. Many years of living within a Hindu cultural environment in Bali allowed me to encounter myths, rituals, and images not in a bookish form, but in a living, everyday context, where symbols continue to function even when their original meanings are no longer explicitly articulated. In such an environment, forms and gestures retain their power, even when the language that once explained them has faded. A significant role was also played by the subtle yet precise observations of my wife, Olga. She was able to notice recurring motifs and forms pointing to the presence of a mushroom cult across a wide range of Hindu narratives, visual representations, and architectural solutions. These insights became an essential external perspective, one that made it possible to see what had long appeared as mere background. Finally, an important foundation for this work was my personal experience of immersion into altered states of consciousness induced by the sacred mushroom. This experience is not offered here as preaching or proof. Rather, it provided a key to a different way of reading myths, not as abstract allegories, but as descriptions of lived states and processes of consciousness. It was precisely at the intersection of cultural observation, shared reflection, and direct experience that the idea emerged to consider Hindu mythology, iconography, and ritual tradition as encoded knowledge, a language speaking less about belief and more about direct ways of apprehending reality.